All right, this is episode 4 of the IWG podcast, as we call it, the Leftcom cast. And I want to start off this episode with a little book report. Not really a book report, more of a podcast report. So recently, I was like just scrolling around on the internet, trying to keep up with the news, and I came across this thing from the New York Times talking about how Andrew Cuomo is now a podcast host and that he has a podcast called As a Matter of Fact. And I instantly thought to myself, oh, this is going to be great. This is going to be like a little funny opener for the podcast. It was not. This was one of the darkest, most soulless things I've ever listened to in my life. This was an hour-long podcast. It was 58 minutes. It took me 2 hours to listen to it because I kept having to pause every other sentence and just walk around my room for a little bit. So I'm going to describe my suffering and pain to you all right here, right now. A little background for those who don't know. Andrew Cuomo was governor of New York for some time. I believe last year he had to resign because his own state AG came out with a 165 page document substantiating the claims of 11 women that accused him of sexual harassment. Cuomo's response to that was not great. He essentially argued that it wasn't sexual harassment, that was just him being a touchy Italian. And he did like mention his Italianness like as a reasoning for it. And then he held out for about a month as every Democrat worth their salt was telling him to resign. He's been out of the public eye for several months now, and now he's coming back as a podcast host. Currently, there's only one episode about it, and it was actually pretty hard to find. It took me a while to find the first episode, but I did. The premise is quite revolutionary. It asks the bold question of what if there was a podcast where people from both sides of the aisle sit down and try to work together to bring about rational, pragmatic solutions for that the people want, while also bemoaning the extreme left and right. But the funny thing about this is that Cuomo spent a lot of time hyping himself up and talk about how he was a progressive champion against the establishmentarians who were too afraid of change. So, already off to kind of mixed signals on that front. The first episode begins with this really long background of Andrew Cuomo, like himself giving his own background. And at no point does he ever mention that he had to resign because, he was sexually harassing 11 women at his office. But he did refer to this period as a several months of reflection. Also, what strikes you is that Andrew Cuomo is not an airwaves guy. His voice and way of speaking reminds me a lot of Gus Fring from Breaking Bad, except with no suaveness, and he constantly repeats phrase to the point of ad nauseum. His first guest is Anthony Scaramucci, someone who is very, very clearly a reactionary, but has enough media training to fly under the radar to the most blank-brained liberals like Cuomo. For example, he asserts that his alma mater at Tufts is requiring white students to denounce their whiteness. He says that MAGA, QAnon, and Trump's victory were not because of any reactionariness that lies at the heart of suburban middle-class Americans, but because the woke mob just emboldened them too much. He also says that, dog whistles about Chicago, NYC, and San Francisco, and immediately follows that up by saying, it's not political, it's observational. And of course, Cuomo does not push back on any of this. Scaramucci also weirdly asserts that Cuomo himself is a victim of cancel culture, and that the establishment Democrats saw his rational, pragmatic governorship and put out the hit on him to ruin his political career. And again, Cuomo says nothing. You can actually hear him kind of say, yeah.
That doesn't speak to his own insecurities whatsoever as a centrist lib, not even a little bit.
Yeah. Anyway, Cuomo and the Mooch have the most bland discussion about Trump and his administration. If you ever watch just a regular episode of MSNBC during the Trump administration, they're saying the exact same thing here. His next guests were two liberals, and I honestly can't even really remember their names because he doesn't introduce them the same way like he does the Mooch. He kind of just cuts to his interview with them. I do know that one of them was from the Brookings Institute, and again, nothing really of note except that she argued that we should return to the party caucus system instead of the national convention system because we need politicians to be peer reviewed. God damn it! And I honestly don't even remember what the other guy said. And I don't even think they really introduced him by name. This podcast was really horribly edited. But the final 5 minutes of this podcast is like Cuomo's solution. What is his solution? I don't really know because as much as he likes to repeat the phrase pragmatic progressive, what that actually means is very unclear. There was some discussion of a bipartisan committee to handle things like COVID, but again, not any real long-term solutions. That was all just reflective. But he does try to leave Democrats with two pieces of advice. Think about the economy is one of them. And he also believes that Dems should not embrace the radical demands like defund the police, which he says, and I quote, as we say in Queens, that's just dumb. Oh, and also don't attack Republicans. I mean,
of course, a lib from the police state of New York City is like,
exactly,
don't attack the police. Like,
I had to pause for 10 minutes and walk around my room for to just because again, he's not even attacking abolish the police. He's attacking defund the police, which is that was the compromise that liberals gave. So he's a right of center Democrat in this regard.
He's very much a product of his era, that late Bush years, early Obama
he
years,
loves Clinton. He loves Bill Clinton. He constantly talks about how much he loves Bill Clinton on the podcast and how Bill Clinton was a bipartisan guy. He got a lot of things done.
Which is hilarious because the right in the 90s that's a lot of what we recognize as the QAnon conspiracy theories. A lot of the origins of that stuff go back to the 50s, but in the 90s there was mailing lists about the New World Order and how everybody was going to get which I mostly associate them with the fluoride shenanigans, but yes, same idea. They go back to the 50s, but where that stuff really took hold was with the increase in reactionary media in the 90s. Fox News came up. There was Rush Limbaugh blew up in the 80s, and Dr. Laura was still on the air, on talk radio, and all of them were bemoaning the terrible globalist conspiracy New World Order politician Bill Clinton, who was just a right winger by any other standards. It's amazing to me that that the libs are just incapable of seeing history repeat over and over again. There is no way they can be more right wing of the Republican Party, be more reactionary, and be accepted. That's just not how it works.
Yeah, that's all true. And I think him trying to say don't attack the police is a perfect example of that, because Cuomo is of the school that there is some hopes that the Democrats can out patriot the Republicans. And I'm sorry, it doesn't matter what you say. A good 15% of this country believes that you, Andrew Cuomo, and Hillary Clinton eat children. There's no way you're going to convince them that you're on their side. Their entire worldview is completely it's completely dualistic. There is good and there is evil. The Democrats are literal evil, they worship Satan, and you and the Republicans and Donald Trump are good. And so you're never going to be able to them on this stuff. You're only just shooting yourself in the foot, and only in more realist, in terms of real life impact, just hurting other people. But anyway, to kind of close off this segment, there is a lot of solace in knowing that absolutely no one is listening to this podcast, and no one is ever going to listen to this podcast. Not only was it super hard for me to find, if you look it up on Google, almost the entire first page is just newspaper articles to the podcast. But also, apparently, and this is what I read on, I think, Axios, he's going to be paywalling all future episodes after episode 2, which is very laughable considering that he openly mentions that he wants this to be like the new platform for the pragmatic American. So, like, there is no value in this podcast. Like, I can't, I want to recommend it to people, like, just to, like, endure what I had to endure. But it tells us, it, it tells us what we already know, which is that the centrists have nothing and they never will have anything. He likes to keep pointing out to the achievements of his administration, like gay marriage and, quote, free college for the middle class. But for a show about providing an alternative solution to current issues, those proposals are non-existent. And even when you can like piece together little bits from like offhand comments that he made, it's just completely impractical. Um, oh, and also another thing is very clear is that he really is like scared or like hates like the squad or like Bernie Sanders. And I think about that as like if he's so like worried about these little social democrats, like what does he think about us? Thank you for listening to my little TED talk.
Oh, thank you for like putting yourself through that for us, Andromeda.
It was
Yeah,
really
thank
hell.
you.
I wish I had the ability to like hate listen or hate watch things, but I can't. Like
I
I just
can't.
get mad and I have to pace around the room.
Yeah,
I'm in
me
the
too.
same boat on that. Like I can briefly browse stuff on the internet in text format for like recreational outrage, but within 5 minutes I'm like over it and I'm just genuinely mad, and I've done that to myself. So then I feel like a loser. And
Yeah.
like with actual media, with like video or audio recordings, I can't even. Um and you know, like also the way that that makes me feel like a loser. This is the same thing that the audience for like Cuomo's podcast or the aforementioned right wing media does to themselves on a daily basis. And I can see how it produces like these like neuroses and like issues like in their perception of themselves in the world, because that shit is just not healthy for you, man.
Yeah,
I
it's
can't
definitely
believe this is
not.
how he decided to come back. Like this is his attempt to like come back into the spotlight. And oh, also just like one more final funny thing. His brother, Chris Cuomo, you know, the who was a former CNN anchor, but he got fired because it got revealed that his brother was basically coming to him for advice on like how to use the media to push away from his sexual harassment scandal. So Chris
Oh, you know,
Cuomo got fired.
that's funny.
But he's on a
You
new
know,
thing. He has a new show on like this new network called News Nation. And it's his old 9 p.m. spot. But it's like it's like he had to go to like some Twitch channel to become a news anchor again. And I just find that very funny. It's so funny that like both of these guys lost everything from this like this horrible sex scandal, like sexual harassment case. And they both have just like had to settle for being the king of like the mud.
It's
yeah.
it's
Like
a
they can't
tale's
learn to
old
just
as
like
time
leave.
with the bourgeois
No, that's fine.
also. Like, I mean, in there's even like this kind of stuff is even addressed in the manifesto. Um, when Marx claps back at the bourgeois for like sharing their wives amongst each other. Like it,
Yep. Also, like,
this criticism has existed for a very long time. They're all disgusting monsters.
definitely. And to add
Yeah,
on to
it's
what
just like
you're saying, wait, guys, sorry, I want to talk. Uh, he also basically, you know how he distracted people from the sexual harassment allegations by legalizing weed in New York. He thought
that was
people would
so
forget
awesome.
about it.
That was so cool.
It
God.
was just a distraction, but yeah.
And like
Um,
you kind of get that sense in his like his podcast too, where like how many of these achievements were just like distractions from another scandal or like something bad that was happening in New York State? Like, I mean, honestly, probably even more egregious than a sexual harassment thing was the fact that he, during COVID, like all the media was hyping him up as like, this is our modern JFK. He's giving us clear, concise, like lectures about COVID. Meanwhile, he took a bunch of old people and he took a bunch of COVID patients and he stuffed them into nursing homes that his friend owns and killed like several thousand elderly people because like they just caught COVID from people in the nursing home and they just died.
Yep, he's responsible for all those deaths.
Yeah, he literally has blood on his hands with that.
No bourgeois
like,
politician doesn't, though. Not
I know,
to
Yeah,
minimize
exactly.
him, but like just to cast a wider net here, like they're all
Mhm.
irredeemable.
I know, but
Yeah.
like the whole point was like the media treated him like he was the next coming of Christ for his like his lectures. There was literally something called Cuomo sexuality where people were like, "Oh my God, Andrew Cuomo, isn't he so hot when he gives his little speeches? Like, isn't he
Yes.
so responsible and strong?" And the media was like eating that up. And like, I'm sorry, there is kind of a double standard because while they were praising Cuomo, they were, I mean, rightfully uh like talking down about Trump's response to the thing, but Cuomo also killed a bunch of old people.
Yeah, and Andromeda, I think it's really just about like the whole like charismatic politician thing. Like Andrew Cuomo's not the first to do that. There's like a lot of other politicians back in the few decades ago that like old bourgeois women just sexualize. Or it's not
Yeah,
even like
it's really
yeah,
weird.
it's a lot of it is really just like personally like using their charisma to appeal to this demographic in order to garner votes at the end of the day. It's like a parasocial relationship type thing. But yeah, like you'd mentioned earlier, I think like it is really like a distraction from the fucked up things that they do. And Andrew Cuomo is just one example of the various politicians who do that. Like so many of the scandals that we hear about in the news today are distractions from like what's really going on, like the strikes and the protests that have been happening, like on an international scale, really. And I
Yeah.
think this is like a good good segue into our next topic.
But if I can kind of just leave off on one final note, the worst thing about that, and you do mention like the idea of the charismatic politician has been around forever. He's not charismatic. He sounds like a knockoff Gus Fring. Like he has like this weird cadence and like this strange monotone that it's weird to listen to. Like especially if you're not like looking at him on TV. Like just his voice is strange, and like he's this old guy who's just like his attempts at his sexual harassment just goes to show kind of how pathetic like he was. I know I'm kind of rambling on, so
So
That's all good.
let's move
what you
on
mean,
from a
but
charismatic politician to one who probably wishes she was. Um, we have the Liz Truss drama going on across the pond over in the UK right now. And I don't know how much of this you guys have been able to follow, but it ties into something that's, you know, a little more important than just a single prime minister in the UK. So Liz Truss just stepped down, the conservative reactionary prime minister in the UK after 45 days. So go her. She set a record. She's the
44, I believe.
The shortest standing PM in UK history. So much like Johnson before her, she was a coalition government leader. So there was no real demand among the British people for her policies, but she did have a whole lot of support from British right-wing media. Like there's some parallels I'm seeing here, guys, from the American perspective. So when Johnson was when Johnson stepped down in like total disgrace amid like controversy after controversy and Garden Gate and multiple vacations and stuff. He left with the inflation numbers, which are going to sound familiar for all of our American listeners. Like, this is a global problem. Already like creeping up significantly. I think it was at something like 6% or 4.5% or something. Point. He did nothing about it, and just kind of pushed it down the road for whoever would take over for him. And that ended up being who immediately put forward the growth plan, which was characterized as a mini budget in UK media. And it was basically like Reagan, Thatcher, like trickle up economics. So I'm just going to go through a quick Wikipedia description of what exactly it did, because otherwise I would just be paraphrasing it. So basically, in September 23rd, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, delivered a ministerial statement called the Growth Plan to the House of Commons. It was widely referred to as a mini budget, and it contained a set of economic policies and tax cuts, such as bringing forward the planned cut in the basic rate of income tax from 20 to 19%, the abolition of a 45% higher rate of income tax in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, reversing a plan to increase corporate taxes from 19 to 25%, and the reversal of an increase to national insurance. So they had to dial back some of it, but Truss basically classified the mini budget as a financial event, which allowed it to avoid the scrutiny of the Tories' own Office of Budget Responsibility. And all of this is in an economic climate where the pound was at its lowest point in decades. Mortgage rates skyrocketed to something like 45%. And the state pension fund was nearly depleted, and the Bank of England had maintained solvency. So Kwarteng was ejected from his position after he and Truss announced that they wouldn't change their course. And he was replaced by Jeremy Hunt, who immediately announced additional austerity plan. So we're going like out of the frying pan and into the fire on that one. Austerity isn't a word that we use in the United States very much because it just sounds too bad, but it's a familiar word in this context, where Liz Truss was like brazenly attempting to funnel as much profitability in a bad economy into the hands of like executives and the bourgeois class that she possibly could. The austerity that's apparently an improvement, according to Jeremy Hunt, is the more traditional cut taxes, cut spending, cut everything kind of response to economic issues that we're very well accustomed to here in the US. So to add insult to injury, Hunt's austerity plan ends the one provision of the mini budget that was broadly popular, which was a cap on profits for energy companies. So that was reduced from a 2-year cap to a 6-month cap. And that's super important because in the context of the economic situation in Europe generally, energy costs driving their inflation more than anything. Very similarly to what we experienced during the 70s with like the global oil shortage, which caused like a decade of economic instability globally. We're seeing a lot of the same numbers now that we saw then. And I think a lot of our comrades in the ICT who were there from those days would point to that crisis as being the crisis living through ever since, in smaller reverberations and fits and starts. System has just never retained the profitability that it had before that day. It's been a steady downward spiral by any metric that you judge it from. And most importantly, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall shows a very clear declining arrow when you look on those years from like 1972 leading up till now. But long story short, for Truss, the Tories spent a week trying to figure out how they were going to get rid of her, like publicly, and she stepped down. So 45 days, and she managed to the extent that a bourgeois politician can influence an economy, she managed to influence it quite badly. A lot of the scrutiny that she's received comes from the concept that these politicians, and this is something I'm sure Biden and his followers would love to become more of a talking point. Like, this comes from the perception that like these like political leaders have any control of the economy. Like they through their declaration are the ones who can improve or destroy it. And I mean, it's a complicated beast and their actions can influence it, but ultimately they're responding to an economy. The economy is not responding to them.
So the next topic we wanted to discuss were the rail workers and their struggle for the past few months has been fairly, well, it's actually been going on longer than that, but over the past few months, there have been negotiations going on. And in September 15, they reached a deal after 20-hour talks, basically, that were brokered by the Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh. And essentially, the workers had to agree, basically, they agreed to not strike while the votes are tallied over the next several weeks, meaning like those weeks have passed, but basically when it had happened, they had this deal reached on September 15, which avoided the strike that would have happened on Friday the 14th. So they kept saying, like, the politicians, Biden and also Marty Walsh, who was a former union official, he literally said that it's a very good contract for workers. And this just makes me think about the role of the unions in terms of negotiating labor power between the worker and the employer. And unions are really just negotiators for the state. At the end of the day, they're really holding back workers from reaching, from actually being able to get the demands that they want. Biden himself, too, he was saying that the deal that they reached in September 15th, he said that it was a big win for America. And they promised more worker company agreements in the future, which I thought was hilarious because the big win for America, like, sure, like it's a win for the companies who are profiting. It's a big win for the railroad CEOs and executives, not for the workers who are actually producing the value.
Whenever there is talk about the good of a nation or the good of any large like national boundary, always read between the lines that it is talking about the American bourgeoisie, the Canadian bourgeoisie, or whatever nation that you're talking about at the time. Like, that's what good for the nation means. Like, it's good for the economy in the sense that, like, I don't have to close down my shop.
Mm-hmm.
Or and even also, just be mildly inconvenienced.
Yeah,
exactly. And to add on to that, the whole politician aspect of it, like averting the strike essentially helped Biden avoid the fresh supply chain shortages and the inflation hikes basically before the midterm elections in November. So it's like, it's really the only reason he cares like about this is because he avoided the strike that that came right before the November midterm elections.
Well, and he avoided that strike by being a greasy, disgusting rat with those union leaders too. Like,
exactly.
It's the Lib way.
Exactly. And the union contract talks. So like the unions were representing 115,000 workers and railroads, including Union Pacific, BNSF, CSX, Norfolk Southern, and Kansas City Southern. And essentially, if the deal was accepted, then the workers whose pay had been frozen would win a double-digit increase in wages, and essentially what happened was the workers did not accept the deal, and the politicians here, they in September, they were relieved by when the strike originally didn't happen when it had been planned for September 14th, and because if there had been a shutdown, if the rail had been shut down, it would have frozen almost about 30% of the US cargo shipments by weight. And then the workforce, 30% of the workforce had been fired, apparently, had been fired, or they had lost about 30% of the workforce through the last 6 years due to laying off workers, basically preferring fucking over workers to prioritize investors, essentially. So they lost about 30% of the workforce.
Which is what you kind of expect to see over time in industries like this, with a really advanced composition of organic composition, because you've got such narrow profits, so much investment and such narrow profits, that it makes these railroad workers almost uniquely, it makes them uniquely expendable in the sense that the bosses are going to try to get rid of them as needed to cover costs. But at the same time, because they have to run on that shoestring budget, there's very little wiggle room for the bosses in industries like this, where they need to have their exploitation maximized to get the most they can out of every worker imbuing those materials with labor and value.
Exactly. So when I mentioned that a railway shutdown, it could have frozen almost 30% of the US cargo shipments. So this would shut it down by weight, stoked inflation, and it would cost the economy as much as $2 billion per day. And this would affect a lot of other industries, such as energy, agriculture, manufacturing, healthcare, and retail sectors in the US. So yeah, they really are just happy about avoiding the strike. They don't really care about granting a deal for workers for the sake of actually giving them what they want. It's literally just for them to be complacent. And when I was discussing how they cut almost 30% of the workforce over the past 6 years, part of it was also because of cutting pay and other costs, as well, to increase the profits. And so a lot of it goes back to what you mentioned, Tom, and a lot of this is skilled labor, and there's so much constant capital. These are really expensive trains and things that they're manufacturing, and with the tendency of the rate of profits to fall, the only way for these companies to really maintain their profits is by either firing workers, lengthening the workday, or just essentially having more demands of the workers without increasing wages or decreasing wages, really.
Yeah, they immiserate them further. And it puts them in a situation where they control the number of their workers on their own terms, and it's a good thing for their bottom line. But when the workers control the work, it's an industry that can't handle that. Like, that is a workforce that can make a statement, and can like agitate for like their own labor disputes, because like such a relatively small number of people are working such enormous hours and doing so, like moving billions of dollars of like, equipment and commodities.
That's a really good point. And also to add on to that, now that the union, they've turned down this deal on October 18th, the BMWED also said that they are, like, the workers, they're looking for more paid time off, especially for sick days. And this is essential, especially with like given COVID times, like you can't really predict when you're sick. And now I think it's sort of set up where they are allowed to take the day off, but they won't get paid for it. And it's like many workers have to choose between making enough money to survive, support themselves and their family, and going to work. Like many workers jeopardize their health in order to make a living. So it's like, if you're not offering to pay them that day, then it's like, how are how are you going to afford the doctor's appointment in the first place? Like.
Well, and they also have that point system, right? Where it's like they have to be like, if they don't go to work, they lose like 4 points or something like that. And then like these workers have to go back and be on call 24 hours a day for like 2 weeks straight to get one of those points back. That's insane. It's the most anti-worker like corporate policy I've ever heard of. Like, it's disgusting to think that in 2022 that like we've rolled back the clock on labor protections, and like as a class we've become so complacent that something like that could ever even be thought to be attempted.
Points, like in the sense that do the points have to do with time off, or is it just in general? I'm not entirely sure about that.
My understanding is that it's like literally anything that you do that isn't clocking in on time and being on call. So it would be like any kind of call in for any reason, any kind of late clock in. Yeah.
That sounds worse than elementary school. Oh my God.
It's
like they're treating them like children. Like that reminded me of like the whole like accruing PTO time at my job. It's the worst. It reminded me of this dynamic. Apparently, for the first year, you don't get the PTO time immediately. You have to accrue, and we only get 5 days off the whole year. That includes sick days, and like paid time off. That includes sick days, and not counting the vacation days that the whole school gets, like, and federal holidays, not counting those. But it's like you build up 2.67 hours of paid time off for every 2 weeks you work. So in order to accrue 8 hours of paid time off, so that you can take off one day and get paid for it, you need to be working 6 weeks in a row. And if you take a day off before that, it resets. And if you only have like 2.67 hours built up and you take a full day off, then you'll only get paid for those 2.67 hours of those 8 hours that you worked, that you were supposed to work that day, and then you'll be unpaid for the rest of that time.
I've had jobs with PTO like that before, and like when they're like onboarding you, HR always treats it like it's some type of like amazing thing. They're like, you can use this personal time for anything. if you're sick or if you have childcare requirements or if you just need a mental health day, it's so much better than having sick leave, guys. They try so hard to sell it to you. And then you sit down and you do the math on your PTO and you're like, holy crap, I'm not going to be able to take a day off until like for 3 months if something comes up and gets paid for it. Like if I have to take if I get COVID and I have to miss like a week, like it's going to take me 2 years to build that up. And like
Especially,
as frustrating as PTO is, like this point system was even worse. Like it's amazing. I think like, and I think it's something that like we can all relate to, because I don't think I've ever had a job that's had a leave process that hasn't been disgusting and exploitative and discouraging.
yeah, it's disgusting. And in addition to that, much of the workers, like a lot of this came about during COVID time, because a lot of people they weren't really able to take off, especially because these are essential workers at the end of the day. But it's like you think about how COVID spreads, and it's like you're forcing these workers to come to work when they're sick, and it's spreading to other people. And it's like these people do not care about the long term. All they care about is profit now.
Their earnings reports only go ahead one fiscal quarter.
But yeah, there like another thing regarding this issue is like the whole supply chain. Like because of they have now the union rejected this deal, there is a strike planning going on for November 19th. And because they have this advanced time notice, supply chain managers have essentially been trying to, I guess, deal with the issue of knowing that it's going to be affected. So if the supply chain is messed up because of the strike, it would cost the US economy up to $2 billion a day. So because of that, the union workers, after they had rejected the deal, they had also like the union had essentially proposed a different proposal, and they wanted compensated sick days. Like they wanted 3 additional sick days that were paid. And you know what the worst part is? That there used to be some paid sick days, but in the 1970s, union leaders, they basically negotiated away the paid sick days in exchange for short-term disability benefits. So this is what I was saying earlier, in the sense that unions are really there just to negotiate for the state at the end of the day. It's not really focused on any liberation of workers or helping workers at the end of the day. Because, like, sure, they got their short-term disability benefits in 1970, but now they're dealing with the aftermath of that. They're dealing with not being able to get paid sick days.
Like that's a story you see across so many industries and in so many workplaces, where like the struggles of the workers who came before us to draw concessions from the bosses are used as like a cudgel against us and weaponized against us over time. Anybody who's ever worked in a union shop and hasn't been able to like clock in or clock out like on a reasonable, like as you need, because it's part of a union negotiation that's supposed to guarantee your hours, and now your guaranteed hours are being used to keep you in a workplace when there's no need for your labor, like, and you have other responsibilities, or like, you know, requiring you to use like annual leaves that you don't want, and then denying you annual leaves that you do want, but making you take off like a random week in February because they have to meet some obligation. And it's like, well, if you didn't, and they tell you like, well, this is what you guys said you wanted. Like, so here's your annual vacation. It's in February. And I've had so many issues over the years where like the struggles of the workers of the past have been used as like a weapon against the workers of today. And this is just another example of that. Anyway, I'm sorry to interject. I should keep going.
Oh, it's no problem. That's a very good point that you bring up. And it's very true that it happens in a lot of industries as well, not just the railroad industry, but it is terrible the way it's being used to not even give the workers like what they're asking for. Like they're really not asking for much, especially and the like the ruling class, they want to portray this deal that they're offering to the workers as something like they're acting as if they're giving them like a silver plate or something when it's really like the bare minimum. It's less than the bare minimum. They are apparently offering like a increase in wages, which hasn't happened in a long time. And while that increase in wages is would be beneficial to the workers, they do not want to, simply concede to just that, because we need to go beyond just demanding higher wages. As communists, we want to abolish the wage system entirely. And these workers are caught in this union trap where the union wants nothing more but to maintain the status quo at the end of the day.
And that's their job. Like, I mean, really the thing that the unions do the best these days is prevent the strike.
That's literally their job. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like I will like there's this quote. Union Pacific CEO Lance Fritz told CNBC during an interview on Squawk the Street Thursday morning, "We've got some negotiating to do with that union, and we've agreed to status quo. We're in status quo while we're doing that. I'm confident we will find a way to craft an agreement that can be taken back out for ratification. That doesn't mean a strike is not possible. It just means, in my opinion, I don't think it's probable. We've got plenty of runway to figure it out."
Well, yeah, and if they run out of runway this time, they'll do what they did last time, and they'll just all lie and say that an agreement was reached when no such thing happened to prevent the workers from striking. It's exactly what they did last time, and I'm sure they're not above doing it again.
Exactly. And it's honestly like disgusting how they're portraying it as if they're offering so much like to these workers. Like they're like, this is such a good deal. Like bro, then you take the deal then. If I can buy it. But yeah, it's like they currently rail employees can take off days for any reason, but those days are usually unpaid and they're going to be docked under the railroad's attendance rules. And especially really hard to get paid leave or vacation days approved unless you plan far ahead and you have the seniority to secure them. So it's kind of really hard to make those leave days a sick day, especially because sick days are generally unplanned. Yeah, essentially they're they lack like many of these benefits, and all 12 railroad unions have to approve the contract in order to avoid the strike. So 6 of the small railroad unions have approved it. But the workers with the most concerns are basically about like the demanding schedules that have them on call 24/7, like you mentioned, especially the engineers and conductors too, which are nearly like 1/3 of rail workers. They're voting. They won't vote until next month. So ultimately, also Congress might step in to block a strike and impose a contract if they can't reach agreements. So that's crazy. Like the 5-year deal would include 24% of raises, and like that's the biggest raise in 4 decades. And but basically these recommendations are literally like Biden's recommendations, and they don't actually address any of the workers' scheduling and workload concerns, especially because they've eliminated like a third of their workforce over the past 6 years. And railroads, they don't really want to offer all that much more than what the board recommended. They did agree to give engineers and conductors 3 unpaid days off a year to tend to medical appointments, but there is a catch on that. They have to give a 30-day notice on that.
Oh, that's so generous. And
I bet they think it is. I bet they think it's generous.
And I don't know about you guys. Like, I don't know if y'all have ever been on call, because that's like the current system that they're using to organize these rail workers is a 2 weeks on call system. I did a part-time job as a second job once upon a time, and I was on call for 48 hours once a week, and it was rough. Being on call is hard. Like, it doesn't seem like it would be, because theoretically, you can play video games in your living room with your bags packed, or, just keep a go bag with you in your car and go get groceries. But like, I found myself staying up until like 2 a.m, like half awake in case I would get called in late. And I would wake up and be half awake at like 6 a.m. for the whole rest of the day in case I would get called early because I didn't want to miss that phone call. And it was just constant stress for 2 years. And that's only for 2 days a week, let alone like living like that for 2 weeks at a time, of that like constant anxiety that whatever you're going to do is going to be interrupted, and you can't fall into too deep a sleep because somebody might need you. Like, it's rough. Like, that is a hard way to live.
There was a Vice article that was talking about it, and it was basically an interview with several of these engineers who remained anonymous, and one of them did admit that he fell asleep at the wheel of a train at one point, or that it happens to other people too, just because of what you mentioned, where like you cannot sleep, you can't fully ever be relaxed in an on-call system. And you mentioned that it was hell for just 2 weeks, just 2 days out of a week. But imagine that being 24/7.
Mm-hmm. I can't, and I've worked an
Exactly.
on-call job.
It's just horrible, especially because like here they're talking about the new hires, and they're like real. They're basically saying that the new hires took on the job for the same reason the lifers did, because of all work. Yeah, those new hires came on board for the same reason most railroaders stay for life. Railroading is a career that allows you to both support a family and take deep pride in your work, the AAR spokesperson said. That's verbatim. Like, that's so funny.
Well, and like there's a degree of like passion in like people when it comes to rail lines, but like let's not like lose the forest for the trees here. That's not what drives people to work in these conditions. Like, there's a BNSF hub in my state, and it's known to be a good employer in the small town that it's in, and it's a common work destination because that town is slowly dying. And that is one of the only jobs that pays enough that those people could support a family in this small town. It's the same trap that people get caught up into in small towns where they have like a state prison in them, and that's the only employer for the town. These hubs aren't generally in major metropolitan areas. They're generally in like outside like rural communities. And it provides like a workforce that's like already like more readily exploited because of their lack of access to other opportunities. Like, And I think that was a happy accident for the railroads, you know, in the modern day versus like when they were originally built. But you know, that's that wishy-washy, like support a family and take pride in your work. Like, give me a break. Everybody's working for a paycheck.
Exactly. Now, I think we may have to come to a conclusion today. We've been going on for a while, but we had a really good discussion, especially involving the rail workers, and I'm hopeful that there will be more going on in terms of the rail workers, and I'm hoping, you know, that the strike actually happens on November 19th. Hope for the best. And of course, as communists, we have to be involved with the class struggle. I know that the unions are going to continue to try to maintain the status quo, and politicians and media will push for that agenda. But at the end of the day, all we can do is support the rail workers who are protesting and striking, and support them, the struggle, and stand in solidarity.
I think that's about all that we're going to talk about today. We went a little bit long. It's been a while since we've posted an episode. So I hope that you all enjoy it. And with that being said, I'm Andromeda.
I'm Tom.
I'm Aisha.
And we hope you have a great day.